Okay, so good morning. So what we're going to be doing this morning is we're going to really be covering Ikar 2. But before we do that, let's just do a little bit of a survey, a recap survey of Ikar number 1, and with the following. We spent a little bit of time on the first Ikar, and that is the belief in God. And I'd like to just go through very, very briefly just a few of the main directions that people go in terms of proofs. And what we discussed last week was or the week before was the teleological proof, the proof that if there must be the watchmaker, the watch must have a watchmaker. That's what we discussed last time. Another very different track is what the Kuzari says in this is on the second page. He has a completely different track. It's not to do about looking back into creation and surmising and philosophizing and working it all out. He says a very simple thing, and that is the following in source 3. The Kuzari is a conversation once again between the Melech Kuzar, this king who is deciding on which religion to choose, and the Chaver, who's a representative of Judaism. And this is how the conversation goes. It's about belief in God. So Amar HaChaver, the Chaver, this is the wise man, says, Ilo hayu omrim lecha, ki melech hoidu ish chesed roi leramemo velases kavod ishmoi, ulesaper b'maos b'meshi agia elecha, mitzedek anshe artzoi midasam atavos, v'shemasoam v'matonam b'me'emuna, ha'hiyisa chayav ba'bazeh. So let's say somebody comes to tell you and says, the king of India is a very good fellow, and he's good to his subjects, and he does great things, and he's a very strong leader. Would you be would you be feel there's good commerce and fair commerce? Would you be obliged by that to have any feelings of special attentiveness towards the king of India? Now remember, this is in the day before you could go on the internet and find out anything about anybody all the time. You couldn't find him on LinkedIn at this point in time. So the king of India literally means is the fellow at the other end of the world. There's no way of knowing anything. So here you have hearsay about this person. So would you be obliged to believe in such a story? So Amar Kuzari, so how could I be obliged by such a tale? ואני מסופק עם צדק אנשי הודו מעצמם ואין להם מלך, או צדקוסם מחמס מלכם, או משני הפנים יחד. So I don't know if they're right about the description and maybe they don't even have a king, or tzikosam machmas malcolm, or they're righteous because of their king. It's not clear that if I hear the story that there's any grounds for belief in just what they're telling me based on the little I see. So the Chaver says, but let's change the situation, says the Chaver. If they came shluchav b'tshuras hadios, let's say a delegation now arrives in your palace from India, and they come, eincha misapek she'einam nimtzayim ela be'eretz hodu ba'armonos hamlachim v'chsav mefursam shul me'ito, and they come and they present the signed and sealed letter which is from the king of India. V'imoy refuas she'ein refuas oisam michalecha. So and then they bring with them drugs that and spices that you don't see elsewhere in the world except for they could only have come from India. The shomeres alecha b'briascha, and they're able to maintain your health. And these special weapons, these drugs which could kill any of your enemies, that you could kill them just by spreading or disseminating this chemical warfare. So would your tune change? Now that you got the letter and you see he has actually sent you the products of his country for the good and the bad. So what would you do? So now I would say, well, this delegation, they must have a king because they're obviously coming with real power. And now I realize that what he says actually has to do with me. So now, if you're asked by your courtiers, how would you describe the king of India now? So the Kuzari says, "Betarim asher hisbararu etzli la'ayin va'achaber aleihem asher hayusafik etzli v'hisbararu ba'elah ha'achronim." So I would tell them, based on the experience of what I had by seeing this delegation, seeing what they presented, and seeing the effects of of that which they brought with them from their homeland, I could now describe what the king is about. So this, says the Chaver, is the proof. Amar HaChaver al haderech hazeh heshivuscha kasher shaltani. V'chein pasach Moshe ledaber im Paro. This is what Moshe Rabbeinu says to Paro. Kishamar lo Elokeinu ivrim shalachani elecha. When he says, "Who's your God?" So Moshe Rabbeinu responds, "I'm the God. I am the representative of the God of the Hebrews." Because Avram, everybody knew. Avram was a legacy. He was a hero of all people. דבר אלוקים והנה גויסם ועשה להם נפלאות ולא אמר אלוקי השמיים והארץ שלחני אליך ולא ברך. And so therefore he says, I didn't quote who am I representative of, the person who created the world, because nobody else knew about it. There was nobody around. Humanity didn't exist until day 6. וכן פסק אלוקים דבריו אל העמון ישראל, אנוכי השם אלוקיך אשר הוצאתיך מארץ מצרים, ולא אמר אני בורא העולם ובראם. And he goes on to say in ensuing paragraphs that the reason why we have this belief is not because somebody told us, but because we could see the effects. We were actually present at the revelation of Egypt, the redemption of Egypt, and Sinai itself. So, as opposed to, this is an important point, as opposed to other religions, where the basis of the religion is Paul coming back and saying that he had a prophecy, or Muhammad coming back and saying he had a prophecy, and everybody else saying, well, that sounds very logical, or who's the fellow, John Smith? Right, John Smith, and the adaptations, the dreams he had afterwards to adapt to the reality. In the end of the day, the channel of religion was all through one individual. Whereas Joseph Smith, thank you. In the end of the day, the reason why people believe is because that person had, a closet experience with God, and that's what he says. How do we know he wasn't having an epileptic fit? How do you know he didn't have indigestion that night? We don't know, but we all believe him. We have the belief system based on the fact that, in fact, everybody else was there at the same time. We experienced it, and so therefore, when it comes to this is important when it comes to our beliefs. So why do we believe? So meaning like, okay, that worked for that generation. So why do we believe? Okay, because our parents told us that they were there. And why do we believe them? Because they told us that their parents were there. So okay, so maybe you could say, well, maybe it's just a very tall tale that a lot of people are telling. But in general, right? In general, when a lot of people are saying the same thing, it's very hard to make up a reality. Because let's say Sinai didn't happen, right? There was no Matan Torah. So you have to create a cult, which now alters the history or the memory of not just one person, not just two people. You have to alter the history of a nation so much so that they're going to repeat that same message from generation to generation. The Sefer HaKarim, remember, the Sefer HaKarim is also working with the basic tenets of faith, and he actually divides it into 3. And number 1 is also belief in God, right? So he has to deal with the same thing. And he says, very simple, going back to Newton's first law, that an object will remain in motion or remain at rest unless acted on by an external force. Right, so that's what Newton said. Says the Sefer HaKarim actually before Newton that let's go back. He wasn't using the terminology Big Bang, but let's say there must have been a starting point, right? That's what all Judaism argues, which took a little while for science to catch up. Greece thought that the world always was. But we believe that there's a starting point. So let's go one step before that starting point. So therefore there was, and we'll call it this hydrogen atom, which expanded at a marvelous rate within those first milliseconds. But so what happened beforehand? Meaning, how did it get from dormancy to expansion? Like so you have this. How did if something had the potential to expand, and at this point in time it isn't doing anything? So what made it expand? What changed it? If it was in a latent state, it should remain in a latent state. There needs to be something acting on it in order to be able to open up that realm of possibility. The way the Sefer HaKarim says is, "V'mashe ma'id olav achush mizeh miyitzias advarim min hakoach el hapa'al nuchal lahavi moifes yuni el metzius ha'eloka yisborach al zeh haderech." We can prove that God exists because there's no way for something from getting from potential to actuality without there being something or someone to trigger it. And at that point in time, there's nothing else. So what is there? So that's what the Sefer HaKarim goes. So yes.
Take a radioactive atom. It sits there. It's stable. It's doing nothing. But once every year, 10 years, a million years, it takes off with nothing else. It's inherently unstable at a random time. Say the same thing here.
You're right, but we're talking about a uranium atom which is inherently unstable.
But it looks stable.
It looks stable, but it isn't stable. We're talking about a mass of 243 protons. Do you know what I'm saying? Like when we're talking about a hydrogen atom, which is inherently stable, there's nothing else. There's nothing else that should. Right? Meaning to say, you're looking at something which is inherently unstable, and its stability rate is, we'll call it kill once every so often it will. But over here we're talking about something which there was no reason for it to expand.
How do you know? Maybe it was a tritium atom, which is an inherently unstable.
Who made it?
Where did it come from? Right. So this is the correct. So this is the question. What was before? Physics struggles with this issue. Says the Sefer HaKarim over here is one of the indications that there must have been something or someone, a power or a deity that triggered this. I find one of the most fascinating lines that's taken in general. This is taken in the Discovery Seminar, but Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has a book called The Letter in the Scroll. Actually, has another name. It's called Radical Then, Radical Now in its original, in its English version. In fact, its readership was more non-Jewish than Jewish in the United Kingdom. Which is just very, very fascinating book, and it's all about the uniqueness of Judaism. So it's a very, very fascinating book. If you have a chance to read it, it is very, very much worthwhile. Each chapter is called The Letter in the Scroll. Letter in the Scroll. And so in it he describes, he's talking at the beginning about Judaism, and he quotes a number of, he was talking about how Jews don't find so much special, don't find their uniqueness and endearment to Judaism per se. But he was talking about non-Jews who've looked at history. So one of the examples is Tolstoy in Anna Karenina. This is a quotation from Tolstoy on the left of page 4. He says, "He whom neither slaughter nor torture of thousands of years could destroy, he whom neither fire nor sword nor inquisition was able to wipe off the face of the earth, he who was the first to produce the oracles of God, he who has been for so long the guardian of prophecy, and who has transmitted the rest to the world. Such a nation cannot be destroyed. The Jew is everlasting as eternity itself." So when he looks at reality, looks at history, where does he see? Ultimately, he might not say it himself in the same words, but where's God? God is in the very fact that his agent on earth is still going, despite all this. There was a fellow called Nikolai Berdyaev, and he was actually, in fact, a communist thinker, and he wrote a treatise on communism. And what he did was he investigated all world cultures, and he came to the Jews, and he had to do an about face. And he writes the following. He says, "I remember how the materialistic interpretation of history, when I attempted in my youth to verify it by applying to the destinies of peoples, broke down in the case of the Jews, where destinies seemed absolutely inexplicable from the materialistic standpoint. Its survival is a mysterious and wonderful phenomenon, demonstrating that the life of this people is governed by a special predetermination, transcending the processes of adaptation expounded by the materialistic interpretation of history. The survival of the Jews, their resistance to destruction, their endurance under absolutely peculiar conditions, and the fateful role played by them in history. That's an important point. It's not just that they survived, but that they carry on impacting history. That's a very important point. All these point to the particular and mysterious foundations of their destiny." Now, he's not using the word God, right? But what essentially is he saying is that there must be something. What was the word he used? He said predetermination, special predetermination, right? So sometimes another way of looking at or finding Hashem is not necessarily just teleologically, or whether it be in transmission or tradition, or in actually the idea of the great mover or the beginner, but just in history itself. And this is a very powerful thing, which I think where it resonates with a lot of us. Now, the reason why, when you go to a discovery seminar in Eishat Torah, they do fabulous discovery seminars in Jerusalem, in the Old City, and they're really interesting. They actually do one for yeshiva guys. Now, in Kerem B'Yavne, the whole yeshiva went for like a few days, and they spoke to the yeshiva. It was very fascinating. They talk about all these types of proofs. In the end of the day, the reason why you and I believe is not because of this. These all make a lot of sense, and we resonate with them, and some more than others, and some, right? But at the end of the day, the reason why we believe isn't all of these. You know why? Because if there was a proof which was absolutely full proof and completely irrevocable, then why isn't the entire world believing? Meaning, if one of these was so ironclad that there was nothing else to say about it, then everybody in the world should just drop what they're doing and become either Jewish or Shomer Shiva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and that's it. What it is ultimately comes back to the two words of the Rambam, and that's what we discussed last time, is the Rambam requires us Leida and Lahamin, to know and to believe. Leida means we study a lot of this. We'll do surveys, we'll read a lot about this, and there's a lot to discuss within these and more. But in the end of the day, it's also Lahamin, which means to say, to translate that knowledge into the way we actually conduct our regular conscious life. That's the challenge of this Ikar over here, is to integrate all the various things that we hear, which are all going to have little snippets that resonate in different ways, to more of a composite consciousness, which is ultimately the way we're supposed to interact with reality. That's the challenge of this Ikar. Yes.
Lahamin, with the faith in what? That there's a God who's a creator, or that the Jews are the legacy of God and there was a Sinai?
At this point in time, it's about that there is a God. That's Ikar number one. We're going to get to the rest of that as we go into the next Ikarim. The next Ikar itself, now this is why we expand. Okay, God, it's very important. We need to have God in the picture, number one. But now it gets more complicated and more interesting. Okay, so now that you do have God, so now the next Ikar is the following. Let's move on. This is today's topic. This is very fascinating. And it sounds very esoteric, but it is absolutely practical. We're going to get to it in just a moment. The next Ikar is read in the Rambam himself on page 5. Ikar 2, one and not what. So this is the way the Rambam words it in himself in the top of the page. By Yasod Hasheni, the second Yasod. That's his second Ikar, Achdusa Yis'ale, which is the unity of Hashem, who's elevated. That means that he is the cause of everything in the world. Not like the unity of one species or type. And not a composite being that's part of lots of ones, right? Lots of a company which has lots of different, cells, and therefore it's one because of that. And it's not like one body, which you say that's one entity. Which can be subdivided. He is one with no parallel. When we say Shema, we're actually identifying this particular Yesod Hashem as one. He's told us what it's not, but he hasn't told us very easily what it is. You see, he's saying it's not like one when you say that, this one individual, not this one composite being, but it's very hard to understand from the Rambam. So what is it? What does Achdus mean? Yichud. What does Yichud actually mean? Yichud means like unity, right? So Hashem is unified. So he's told us what it's not, but it's very hard to understand what the Rambam actually means. The way this translates in our Siddur is the following. We say, Ani Mamin b'emunah shlema, Shabari Yisparach Shmoi, hu Yachid is singular, but that's not enough. En Yechidus kamoihu b'shum panim. There's no other type of unity like him in the world. And he is one in time, both past, present, and future. The way we say it in Yigdal is Echad ve'ein yachid ki yichuda. We say it's one, but not just one, as we translate one. One as there's no, again, the same. There's nothing else like him. Ne'elam v'gam en sof la'achtus. So he is hidden, and there's no end to his achtus. Now, he seems to both the Ani Mamin and the Yigdal seem to be bringing in the element of time. Do you see that? It brings in time into this, where there's a notion of Haya Hava V'yeh, past, present, and future, and also in the Yigdal is Ein Sof Lachtus, so there's no end to his unity. Okay, so time is part of that. It means to say that part of what Yichud must mean is that over time it has to be the same God. By the way, that's what Rashi says when it came to Matan Torah. When it came to Matan Torah, Hashem, Rashi says that he was like in gentleness compared to the Ishmael Choma at the sea. That the same Hashem was the one who broke down the sea and killed the Egyptians and then embraced Israel. And the point was to show that whatever interaction that God had at different times in history is all the same God. That's a very important part. Meaning the different times you'll see the world in different modes are still Ein Sof La'achtus. So it means to say that there's still Hashem behind all of it. It's not that Hashem, has somebody else acting in his position. Yes.
Ein Sof La'achtus could just be a measure of quantity that's not like an infinite time, not so much in time. There's no end to his singularity.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. I was limiting to time. You're right. It's more than that. It's more than that. He's beyond time, but there's more than that to Yichud. It's not just beyond time. It's a little further than that. But let's take this further. Very simple game. We say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad every day, right? So Hashem, listen, O Israel, Hashem is our God, Hashem is one. So let's play this very simple game. They do this in the SATs, a lot of more complex level, where you have to give the antonym. So if I tell you black, will you tell me? If I tell you down, happy, young, one. Good. So this is the problem. So when we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, what are we saying? One and not what? What are we saying when we say a yichud?
Not more than one.
Not many.
Okay, so this is where it's fundamental. This is where we get down to the fundamentals.
Anything else?
So echad, usually we say we figure it's not two, right? So that means to say that there's nobody else in the cockpit, right? There's nobody else driving the plane. So that's the most basic level of yichud. What yichud really means is based on the pasuk we also read yesterday. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Echad is Parshas Vayischanan, as we read yesterday. But Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is modified by another verse in the parasha, and that is Ato Hareis Aladas. This is as we read yesterday. Ki Hashem Hu Elokim, Ein Od Milvadoi. There is nothing else besides for Him. When we say one, we mean to the exclusion of anything else. That means to say that no matter what you look at, whether it is a physical item, whether it is a phenomena, whether it is a historical phenomenon, there is nothing that you can point to in the world which is not God. You see that? That's a very powerful statement. When you say Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that means to say that flat tire, right? Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, He's there. He was sitting on the side of the road with you. Okay, that's what we're saying. Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That's a very powerful statement. That's a very troubling statement at the same time. Why? Tragedy, right? So what's happening over here is what we're saying, what the Rambam is expecting and telling us to say is that Yichud means to say that when we look at the sum total of our lives and the full history, because our lives is a little blip on the radar, if you think about it in terms of world history, there is only Hashem in everything. Now, listen to the one sefer which deals with this on an incredibly profound level is the sefer by the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, called Das Tvunos. Very deep sefer, very beautiful sefer, and he deals with Yichud. And he presents to us 5 sets of people who struggle with this in different ways, and I think we can resonate. And in fact, if you look around carefully in society today, you could identify each of these 5 groups. He talks about the following. I'm starting by the first arrow on the right in source 8. This is in Das Tvunos section 36. He says, Hinei, ha'avodah zarah, First group of people who struggle with God being everywhere. So, you know what they do? They serve Avodah Zarah. It says, they're different types. Hamina echad chashu habare baruchu na'ale min advarim hashvalim ve'enu mabit bohem v'yesh acherim tachtov heim ha'koich ve'ashamayim v'ksileihem sareim v'chot tzvam sheim ashkichim ba'olam. So you know what? God is here, but then what happens is he has deputies. You know, he has the Secretary of Finance. He has the Secretary of Energy, and he has all these. He has a whole cabinet, and they're all in charge of the different things, and that's why they serve them. So therefore, that's why we speak to the cabinet ministers, because we know that God ultimately is not a micromanager. These are Avodah Zarah said. So he's not really actually watching the game all the time. So therefore, we speak to the people who are in charge. Hamina Bey is the other type of idol worship is Amru Chas Shalom Shtei Rishur same. You know what? It might not be that there's God and all his his deputies. Maybe in fact there actually is God and anti-God. Right? There's the power that is against him. Right? Echad b'poel tov ve'echad poel ra. There's the good one and the bad one. The power of heaven, the power of earth, the power of fire, darkness. Right? There's when you go back to good old Zoroastrianism, they've been killed up by the Iranians still. But when you get back to good old Avodah Zarah, the powers of good and bad, right? And the fight between them. There's no such thing as one pole without an opposite. If God means absolute good, there must be absolute bad against him. There's a Gemara in Sanhedrin which talks about how there's two forces within the body called Hurmiz and Ahurmiz. That's the forces of good and evil that are in it's a Greek concept within each within each body. Now, what was that? All Zoroastrian coming from this exactly. Exactly. So, and by the way, with the Gemara at the time of the Babylonian Talmud, one of the predominant issues they were dealing with was Zoroastrianism, right? What is called the Chavarim, were the Zoroastrianists, and it's interesting to see how their philosophy finds their way into the Gemara itself. And Ner Chanukah, there's a whole story about them. It's very fascinating. Be it as it may, what are they struggling with over here at the end of the day? What are these folks, these Ovdei Avodah Zarah, the ones who say that God's got deputies, or the one that says that there's this force of good and force of evil? What are they dealing with essentially? Is this very issue? Is ultimately, how can you say that you're such a thing as a Yechud? Because ultimately we see terrible things happening in the world. So if you have a few people to play with, then you can say, you know what, when that tidal wave happened, it was the bad guy, right? He took over at that point in time, and therefore that's how we can point to it. They're struggling with the same issues of Yichud, and what they've done is they've created a system which allows them to deal with it in polytheism. However, it gets a little more subtle. Hadas Ashlishi, there's a third group of people. Hidas Hamon Anoshim. Most people think like this, says the Das Tfunos. Shechoshin Shedivrei Ha'olam Hazeh, Holchin Lefi Chukos HaTivam Shedbia HaBaruchu BeTachtonim. This world works based on nature. Vishtadlusam V'acharitzusom Hu HaMo'il, V'atzlusam Hu HaMazik. That therefore, if you work very hard and you get a good internship, you're going to get a good job. Right, meaning like it's all about however much you put in is going to be ultimately the only reason that you're ever going to get the right place. Sorry, the pasuk which says later in Dvarim that it is my strength which brought me to this station. So they say, you know what? There may be a God, but ultimately, what did God do? He set up a good system of physics, right? And physics works not just in terms of the physical world; it works in the social realm, and it works in the anthropological realm, and that's the way that that we'll call it social Darwinism as well. And at the end of the day, that's the way the world works. So when you look at the world and you're looking at bad and good things, so how do we deal with it? So why do bad things happen? Because, that statistically, there's some of the time that's what's going to happen, right? Because it's not that there's a force doing it. It's just that God set up the system. And ultimately, you have a bell curve and there's going to be the bad side and there's going to be the good side. And that's the way it is. That's the way that most people think, he says. Again, this precludes Yichud. Because ultimately what you're saying is, can you identify God there? No. You can say that God set the system in motion. But ultimately, he's not there at this point in time. The fourth group, Hadas Aravi, Hidas Goyei Haaretz. The people, the nations of the world say this. So Orim, Chata Yisrael and Yeshua Sola Belukim Sela, Chas Shalom. They say, you know what? We're the downtrodden brother. Israel had it, but they got mixed up and they were rejected, and that's it. And too bad, 2,000 years ago, God changed his mind. Right? This is Christianity, and to a certain degree, Islam. Islam actually changes. It was Yishmael who went up on the arcade and the whole business, right? So. And then finally, I just jump down to Hadas HaChamishi, which is on the fifth arrow. And the fifth group is Hidas Poisha Yisrael Oisam Shayu Mechavnim El Koinam Mechavnim Limrod Boy. They know that there is God and they rebel against him. These last two groups trouble us a little less. These are the groups of people who disagree with God in various ways. The struggle that all of them are having is the struggle of being able to say that everything in the world ultimately is Yichud. So his rejoinder is the following. This is the second last line. Listen how beautifully he says this. This is the second last line on that page here. Eloi, Hulavadoi, we know that Hashem is alone. Moshel Bakol, he controls everything. There's no other power against him. Elohu atzmoi borei hatov, v'hu kinyan hakosov yotzer or, uvorei choshech, oishe shalom uborei ra. When we say in Birkas Kriya Shema, Yotzer or vorei choshech, oishe shalom vorei hakol, that's a euphemism of the pasuk in Yeshayahu, which is uborei ra, which means to say Yeshayahu was also bothered by this. But you know what Yeshayahu says? Uborei ra, that God HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately is also behind that. Now, to the degree of the one-to-one correlation is not so clear. That's what the rest of the Das Tunis is about. But ultimately, what does Yeshayahu do? Is he is precluding all these folks, all these five groups, saying that, you know what? In the end of the day, it's all Hashem. Ani Hashem oise kol eile. Elo she'ein afilu tachtov she'yeh lo shlita ba'olam. There's nobody else. There's no deputy in the world. Dahainu she'ein shum sar v'lo shum koach she'eni k'mo she'choshu ha'avdei avodah zarah. There's no other powers. There's no parallel powers. Hashem is watching over all his creations. Hashkacha pratis. This is to preclude what? This is to preclude group 3, who said that Hashem set the rules of physics into motion, and then he kind of left it and was sipping coffee watching us. And there's nothing which can happen in his world except from his will. There's no such thing as happenstance, nature, mazel. And he controls everything which happens and will happen in all of creation. This ultimately is what Yichud is about. This is a very, very powerful statement. So now you're going to say, so how do we deal with evil? So the rest of the Das Tunas is in fact on that question. This is his introduction to what he's doing. What he's essentially saying is, I need to explain to you how it is that you can, in every history and every moment, you can say, so if Hashem does create evil, did he actually do that, or did he allow it? That's the question that he deals with. Did he create the evil there, or did he allow the evil to? Is evil a he'eder, a lack of God's presence, or is he'eder an action of God? And that's what this comes down to. And it comes down back to that pasuk uboire ra. Hashem creates evil, but ultimately, this is a much bigger topic. This is a much bigger topic. But the point over here is that what is expected of us when we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is this realization. And this is a very hard realization to come by. But on a minimalistic level, when a person is looking at one's day, there are many bumps in a day, smaller, bigger. And we should be saved from the bigger ones. But ultimately, between Shmas, there's a lot of room to think about those bumps and say, despite what happened and those detours, there was I still validate that Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Now, we're not going to have just enough time at this point in time to go into the response of the Rivash, which is very fascinating. We're going to get into next time about the place of Spheros, right? So if this is true, then what does it mean that there's 10 Spheros and the Mekubalim who dive into particular Spheros, and how does that work in terms of Yichud? Very complicated question. Very interesting, coming from the 1400s. But I would like to just close on a more practical note with the following quotation, which is so fascinating. This is from a book called the constant mitzvahs. You know that there's 6 constant mitzvahs, which means to say that at any point in time, outside of the restroom, you're able to be thinking about this. And one of them is what's called Yichud Hashem. One of them is thinking about the singularity of Hashem. So listen to the way he describes it. What was that? 6 constant mitzvahs. Sheish mitzvahs timidios. La'avo, la'av. Well, yeah. Now people talk about it. The Sefer Chinuch is one of them. He brings it up, but this is described. This is the way he describes it in very practical terms. I think it's very meaningful. He says, people often remark, I could not learn today because I caught the flu. Hopefully that's not often, but often people say that. I had planned to daven mincha with a minyan, but my child got sick and I had to take him to the doctor. I wanted to come on time to Daf Yomi, but my car wouldn't start. Such statements are usually accompanied with thoughts, what a shame, I wanted to serve Hashem, but the circumstances in my life prevented me from doing so. When viewed through the lens of Yichud Hashem, such thoughts are ridiculous. If you think that there are forces of opposition preventing you from growing, you then lack the awareness of the oneness of Hashem. There are no forces of opposition. Cold, sick children, the car trouble come from Hashem, and they were created to bring you closer to Him, no less than your Siddur and your Gemara. Certain levels of perfection can be attained by davening and studying in Torah, and others can be attained when you are in bed with the flu or waiting in the doctor's room office with your child. There are aspects of your personality which will be refined when you learn how to deal with the frustration of the car that will not start. Yeah, I don't think he means kicking the wheel. All these obstacles are from Hashem, and they are meant to help you grow, not to get in the way of your growth. If you identify them as struggles that you can overcome, they will help you attain perfection so that you can enjoy eternal reward. Furthermore, although we cannot compare car trouble with death, they do share an underlying principle. Just as dying al Kiddush Hashem means sacrificing the entire growth process, so too dealing with various obstacles that crop up may require us to sacrifice the growth process for a day, a week, or for as long as Hashem wants us to. However, Yichud Hashem should provide the confidence of knowing that the obstacles also bring us closer to Hashem, because every circumstance in life is meant to bring us closer to Him. That's a very profound. Now, this is a very hard thing to hear sometimes, And nobody can prescribe this except for yourself. Meaning, only a person themselves can adopt this. But what he's saying is such a very interesting way of looking at it, as opposed to seeing our pristine life of service of God and then the rest of life, which is the slog work necessary to get there. What he's saying is that don't subdivide, your life into segments. Your whole life is ultimately serving God, and that means on the side of the highway, cranking up your car on the jack is also part of that service, even though it's not excelling at this point in time and having written and being ahead of the daf yomi, or everything, and all the kids' homework is done the next day, and that's one element of it, but the rest of your life is also part of that, which is a profoundly paradigmatic changing. Where's it coming? Life changing. Where's it coming from? Because ultimately, Yichud Hashem dictates that Hashem is not just there when you're excelling. Hashem is there also in the times where it's not so easy. Here's an example he gives is the following. Many Mussar works, Mesilas Yesharim in particular, mention the need to set goals and track our progress in reaching them on a regular basis. Indeed, it is doubtful that one can grow spiritually without setting goals and making proper plans to achieve them. We must be aware, however, that we are not in control of our lives. We may find that our efforts are often being hampered from time to time, and we may find that our plans are entirely impossible to implement. If we do not master Yichud Hashem, we'll become frustrated when we are unable to reach our goals, and we may well blame the obstacles or external forces. Living with Yichud Hashem allows us to be at peace when our efforts are ruined, because we accept each obstacle as a challenge or as a message from Hashem. We are secure in the knowledge that our efforts are not in vain. Each step along the way is guided by Hashem, who wants us to succeed and grow. We know that the only true setbacks are those caused by failure to overcome the challenges or failure to read the messages Hashem is sending. And he goes on, actually I didn't include the next paragraph, but he says in just a page over that therefore one needs to be careful when planning. When one has very, very specific and set expectations and plans, ultimately what you're setting yourself up for is that when there's going to be some deviation, and life has that way of doing it, then you're going to be frustrated because you had a particular goal of the way you thought that you should be guarding your day and serving Hashem. And when that detour happened, you feel that you're being taken off the path. So he said, his suggestion is to be a little more lax about the expectations of your goals. You need to aim high, you need to hope high, but expect a little lower, because ultimately every part of that journey is going to be part of the Yichud. I think this is a very practical way of seeing this. And of course, he's dealing on a more simplistic level. He's not dealing with the bigger issues of life. He's not dealing with we're talking about doctor visits, and there's much more serious things. But this is a model of the integration of this. Yichud Hashem doesn't mean to say just looking in history, but it means to say on a day-to-day basis within our lives itself. I don't remember the author of. I'll double check. I apologize. I should have put it into the notes. Anyways, this is perhaps a practical application. I think that it's worthwhile that perhaps when saying Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, the reason, and this to end on this is so important. The reason why we cover our eyes when we're saying Shema Yisrael is because we acknowledge that this is a very difficult task. The reason why we cover our eyes is because when you open your eyes and look at the world around you, there are so many contradictions to Yichud Hashem that it is an avoida to say Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And that's a recognition which Chazal had, but nonetheless we still say it. Meaning we're going to spend the rest of our lives identifying and making relevant and saying and confidently saying, we know Hashem, that you're one. And sometimes we're going to have to cover our eyes because it's very hard to see that. But ultimately that's the avodah of this particular ikar. And in Mitzvah Hashem, what we're going to do is we're going to continue next week looking at the Rivash about the Siros, which leads us, segues straight into the next one, which is the corporal reality of Hashem. Does Hashem have any manifestation within this world?